Hello and thank you for joining us. My name is Ben Sheen. With me today is Stratfor's Rodger to talk about the latest developments in the South China Sea. So Rodger, the International Court of Arbitration in The Hague has ruled that China's claims in the South China Sea are invalid. What are the immediate implications of this ruling?
Well, I think we have to clarify what the court actually ruled. They didn't necessarily rule that China's claims are invalid. What they did is they ruled on the definition of the pieces of territory that China occupies. And in ruling on that definition, they declared what China said were islands. They declared that these are either rocks or low tide elevations. And what that does is it removed the ability of China to claim an EEZ from those. And it reopened the idea that from the Philippine shore, the Philippine EEZ now runs the full 200 nautical miles out, and the Philippines now has within their EEZ the waters around many of these features. But where the court did rule is it said that if China is joining the UNCLOS, which it did, that in joining the UNCLOS, it revokes any argument that historic rights or non-viable reasoning still stand. So the UNCLOS superseded all of China's older aspects. Now, what does it mean? Nothing at the moment. In the sense that China has said they reject it. Taiwan, who also technically just got caught by this, says it rejects it. Vietnam, who is also caught up in this, even though not being a party, has said that it will come out with a statement later that will further clarify its position, but that it still claims it owns this territory as well. So in the near term, it doesn't have a direct impact, but what it does is it changes in some ways the political discourse, and it strengthens the hand of the Philippines if they want to go into bilateral negotiations with China.
Now, this is clearly a big deal for Beijing, and as a signatory of the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, they technically have to abide by the Hague ruling. What are the chances they will? Because China has a track record of doing pretty much what it wants to.
So China has made it very clear they're not going to abide by the ruling. They chose not to participate in this arbitration. They argue that the arbitration itself is a violation of a previous agreement between China and the Philippines, that things would be handled bilaterally through bilateral negotiations. And they also argue that because this tribunal by default has ruled on sovereignty issues, which it doesn't necessarily have the legal authority to do so, that it should just be nullified and it really doesn't count and apply to them. So on the other hand, China is having internal discussions and has sort of let hints fall out that they may reconsider membership in the UNCLOS entirely. And that would be a big change in the way in which China deals with the international community, because China really likes to emphasize that it's part of this rules-based community, that rules-based is the way things should be, and certainly every country adjusts and interprets the rules to fit their own needs at any time, but at least there's a common framework. If China withdraws from UNCLOS, which wouldn't happen quickly but may occur, that would not only be a rejection of the UNCLOS's legitimacy, but really a rejection by the Chinese of the current structure of global order, which they see as too centered on the United States.
So specifically looking at the US angle in all this, obviously the United States is a key stakeholder when it comes to security in the Asia-Pacific region. How do you think Washington is perceiving this?
So the United States kind of knew which way this was going to go. On the one hand, the US is not actually a claimant here. This was a Philippine action towards China in an international court. The United States doesn't have a direct role in this. And the Chinese have portrayed the United States as being the puppet behind all of this and that they've manipulated the Philippines into this action. On the other hand, the U.S. certainly has come out very quickly, even before the announcement, and said the ruling should be taken as concrete and law and everyone should abide by it. And they've said the same thing again afterwards. And the U.S. does have its own interpretation of what it means to have freedom of navigation through these waters. And it wants to continue to push that and to enforce that concept. Finally, if you look at the United States, it's a treaty ally with the Philippines, a treaty ally with Japan, a treaty ally with South Korea. Each of these countries is very dependent upon these waters, either for fish and maritime resources or for transit of resources to and from their countries.
So you mentioned the fishing aspect, which is clearly a big part of this. How does the ruling affect the the way that the waters are actually fished?
So one of the things we've seen is that there's greater competition in the waters that are sort of in between all of these countries, because many of the countries have overfished their nearshore waters. And so over the last several years, we've seen the fisheries move further and further into this central area of the South China Sea that's largely disputed territory. The ruling may actually encourage countries to accelerate that, to move more fishermen into the space to try to assert their claim over these territories. In the long run, there's a potential that this may also help to lead to more cooperation in the region over management of the fisheries, because as they continue fishing at this rate, they do run the risk of overfishing. And we've seen in other parts of the world where this type of heavily competitive overfishing ultimately does lead to some sort of regional mechanism to manage fisheries. The fisheries and the fish themselves and the other sea creatures really don't respect national boundaries or EEZs, and that makes it very complicated.
Very much so. Well, Rodger, thank you so much for taking the time to go through this clearly important topic with me today. For more on the South China Sea, Asia Pacific region, and the world, continue to read stratfor.com.